Welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I investigate the life, conquests, character, and legacy of the infamous 14th century warlord, Amir Timur. Before we get right into this, I do have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, it is raining outside, as well as my neighbors above me have been singing for the last half an hour. So if you hear thunder, rain, or the wonderful chorus coming from the roof above me, well, just do your best to ignore it. I'm sorry, but I've procrastinated recording this episode long enough, and I have to get it out today. I have to. Otherwise, it's just another session of crying in the shower, and nobody wants that. But secondly, we've had quite a few people join us in the last week or so. So if you are new, welcome. I'm glad you're here. And thirdly, I wanted to say thank you to the many people who have reached out to me in the past few weeks. Quite frankly, it's been a bit overwhelming to get all of this support and encouragement, and I mean that in a good way. And so I want to thank you all. I want to thank you by name here, but knowing me, I would inevitably forget somebody's name, offend them, and then this blood feud would arise between our two families, lasting generations, and that would just be a whole thing that I don't have time for, so I don't really want that. But all that to say, if you've reached out to me, you know who you are. Thank you for doing that. Seriously, it means a ton. I love hearing from you for any reason, so always feel free to reach out. Also, for those of you who have donated to the show, thank you as well. I will thank you by name at a later time, but your generosity helps tremendously. But to everybody, thank you for joining me on this adventure. I love every minute of making the Timur Podcast, and knowing that you're enjoying it or getting something from it too, or maybe you're tied down and someone's forcing you to listen to it, well, it means the world to me, so thank you for joining me. Okay, but enough mushy chit-chat. Let's get into the history after one more quick thing. So, throughout this podcast, I have and will make mistakes. This is unfortunately just inevitable. I am, alas, only human. Now, I will of course do my very best to avoid mistakes, of course, but they're just gonna happen. If you notice I say something that's wrong, or maybe I said something that just doesn't make sense, or maybe I forgot to edit out an 8-minute period of time where I'm just talking to my cat about his lack of respect for me, just let me know what I've done, and I'll do my best to fix it. But seriously, things do get past me, so always feel free to let me know. And speaking of, I do have a bit of a correction to make. The episodes that I dubbed The Desert Years, which released recently, cover Timur's life in the years from 1363 to 1365. This might not be accurate. I say might because it's really hard to tell. What I originally thought was the case in that 1363 to 1365 period was when Timur and Husayn were doing what we talked about in those episodes, and then, in the year 1365, they began their attempt to reconquer Transoxiana. That might be true. That might be... I might have been right, maybe. But our sources just don't agree on the dates. One of our sources say that the reconquest attempt began in 1365, another says 1363, and a modern historian that I typically always trust, she says that it began in 1364. And we may never know the exact detailed chronological outline of these 3 years or so, so what I'm going to do to fix this is by saying that the events of the 2 Desert Years episodes, along with the events of today's episode, this all happened, probably, between the years 1363 and 1365. Therefore, the different chronological layout possibilities all fall within this set of years. Again, the events are the same. We're not changing the events here, but the exact dates might be different. But these 3 episodes take place between 1363 and 1365. I know this may seem a bit unimportant, and it might be, but it was keeping me up at night knowing that I might have lied to you. Well, at least that lie was. The other lies I can live with. Okay, with that all said though, let's join Timur again to see what happens next. When we last left Timur, he was with his brother-in-law and ally Husayn, and the two men were gathering an army to retake the land of Transoxiana from the oppressive Moghuls. And as we saw at the end of the story 2 episodes ago, as the two brothers were approaching Transoxiana, more and more people were joining them. The Moghuls were horrendous rulers, and the people of Transoxiana were a people who valued freedom and tribal autonomy. Thus, men from the Saldus tribe, and the Barlas tribe, and the Karaunas tribe, and many other tribes leave to join what they see as the liberation force. These tribes all had their petty, age-old rivalries, but those could be set aside, because the Moguls were oppressing everybody more than any of these other tribes had ever done. And in addition, Afghan tribesmen and rulers who had once been a part of Hussein's little kingdom, they start to join too, along with Persian adventurers and mercenaries, and all sorts of people from all walks of life. This was an army composed of everybody, pretty much. But it was not enough. Timur and Hussein's ranks were probably in the hundreds, maybe in the low thousands, but the occupying Moguls and the allies of the Moguls numbered much more than that, possibly as many as 20,000 men according to one source, and although this is likely an exaggeration, as most medieval sources tend to exaggerate, it's a favorite pastime, but the fact of the matter is that Timur and Hussein are greatly outnumbered. Now, let's take a minute to quickly review the broader political situation of these Moguls. If you go back, you'll remember that the great Mongol Empire founded by Genghis Khan eventually broke into 4 parts, or 4 khanates, which had technically existed for a while, but really became more autonomous with the death of the 4th great Khan, Mongke Khan. And one of these khanates was the Chagatai Khanate, situated in Central Asia. So if we skip forward about a century or so to about the year 1347, the Chagatai Khanate split into 2 separate political entities due to internal strife. The western half, called Mawaranar or Transoxiana, is the land that Timur was born in, and it's now the land that he and Husayn are going to try and liberate. But the eastern half of the Chagatai Khanate was Moghulistan. And in the 1360s, Khan Tughlaq Timur of the Moguls here in Moghulistan invaded Transoxiana, conquered it, and thus reunited the 2 halves of the Chagatai Khanate. So where we are now, Khan Tughlaq Timur is still alive and still Khan. He is currently in the eastern half of his realm, in Moghulistan, ruling from there and making sure everything and everyone is in order. But he knew that he couldn't leave his recent conquest of Transoxiana without a firm presence. So the Khan left his son, Ilyas Hoja, to rule Transoxiana with a large force in order to keep the Khanate from breaking apart again. So what does this mean for Timur and Husayn? Well, it means that things are not going to be at all easy for them. To liberate Transoxiana, first they're going to need to defeat any Moghul or Moghul allies that oppose their crossing into the region. If they get past this, they are somehow going to need to defeat Ilyas Hoja and his huge army. And let's say that against all odds they actually do this. Well, then they can be sure that Ilyas's father, Khan Tughlaq Timur, is going to invade again with an even larger army. And given that Timur and Husayn only have a few hundred or maybe a few thousand guys with them, this looks pretty much impossible. But Timur and Husayn know this. They know they're going to need more men. Now, before we move on, let's talk a bit more about Husayn. Because we've talked about him some, but we need to talk about him a bit more. Every source that we have on these events was written because the authors were interested in Timur's story, and whether or not these sources were pro-Timur or anti-Timur or whatever, their primary focus is entirely on Timur. Therefore, they'll mention Husayn as he's a key component to Timur's story, but they always cast him as like a second-in-command to Timur, or just some guy who's following Timur around. They don't really give Husayn much attention. And this makes some sense, as Timur will become, well, the Timur we remember, while Husayn doesn't even have his own Wikipedia page. But this is all pretty misleading. In reality, at best, Timur and Husayn were viewed as equals by themselves and everybody else. But what I find more compelling is that it was probably the exact opposite of what the histories portray it as. I think, and not just me, of course, several modern historians also think, but no, I think what's probably more accurate is that Husayn was largely seen as the leader of this liberating expedition. And it was probably Timur who was seen as a kind of second-in-command, or at least a figure who wasn't as prominent as Husayn. Because, think about it, who is Husayn? Well, first of all, Husayn is grandson of Amir Khazagan, and Khazagan was the last real ruler of the free peoples of Transoxiana before the Moguls invaded. And that family title is bound to ignite some patriotic feelings. Secondly, Husayn has already ruled a small kingdom of his own. He had gained control of the city of Kabul, the surrounding lands, and a few other key cities as well. Sure, he had been defeated and lost all of this, but he was alive and now trying to reconquer them. And wait a minute, just how had he lost this kingdom? Oh, right, it was because he stood up to the invading Moguls while everybody else bent the knee. So even though he was defeated, he was seen as a hero already, as an icon of liberation, as somebody who had been an emir before, was a descendant of emirs, and was now ready to become emir again. Now, compare that to Timur. Timur wasn't a nobody, for sure. He had been the governor of the city of Kesh, and he had wrestled control of the Barlas tribe. He was one of us, one of the people, but he had also submitted to the Moguls. Twice! And in addition, he had gained his power largely due to the fact that it was awarded to him by the Moguls. Now, sure, this may have been a good move for him personally, and yes, it did eventually backfire, and okay, Timur is still a compelling leader, but compare that to Husayn. I just don't think there's too much of a comparison here. So the histories often make it sound like Timur was just kind of dragging Husayn around, and that it was always Timur who was leading things, but I don't know if I buy that. I think it was much more likely a two-man effort, with Husayn having a bit more prestige and influence, probably. But okay, let's get back to things. So Timur and Husayn need allies to move forward. And fortunately for them, there are other political players in the nearby vicinity. The region of Badakhshan was east of Transoxiana, but had managed to stay somewhat free of Mughal rule. Today, Badakhshan would be located in the mountainous region of northeastern Afghanistan and eastern Tajikistan. And in the 1360s, this region was somewhat autonomous, being led by several powerful Afghan tribes and various city-states. And the rulers of Badakhshan were obvious allies for Timur and Husayn for two major reasons. First of all, Badakhshan was east of Husayn's previous kingdom centered around Kabul. Therefore, the leaders of Badakhshan knew Husayn. They probably had previous political relationships even. Thus, they were much more likely to hear him out than strangers would have been. But secondly, and more importantly, the rulers of Badakhshan were very worried about their northern neighbors, the Moguls. Because if the Moguls solidified their rule and destroyed all rebellion, well, Badakhshan could very well be the next on their to-do list. And everybody knew the stories of just how awful Mughal occupations were. So, as Timur and Husayn are now on the border of Transoxiana, they decide that before they take on the Moguls with their very limited numbers, they need to go to Badakhshan to ally with the various rulers there. And so off they go. But of course, word was spreading that Husayn and Timur were back, and that they had an army with them, and everybody knows that they intend to try and free Transoxiana. And that includes the Moguls. So Ilyas Hoja, the son of the Khan, begins gathering his vast forces and allies, but meanwhile some outlying scouts and allies of the Moguls, who are much closer to Timur and Husayn's location, they decide to attack. Timur and Husayn plan to cross the Amu Darya River into Transoxiana and then head east to Badakhshan. But when they arrive at the Amu Darya, they soon find the enemy waiting on the other side. Now, this isn't the main Mughal force. It's a combination of Mughal scouts and tribal allies, including many of the men of the Saldus tribe, but it still numbers maybe as many as 6,000 men, while Timur and Husayn maybe have half that number. But as it is now, the river lies between both the armies, so there's not going to be a battle just yet. But if Timur and Husayn wait here, more and more enemies will show up, because now they know where the two men are and that they've returned and they're here on the border. So the brothers begin to march east alongside the river, and the enemy on the other side follows them, with neither side able to engage the other, or willing to engage the other. But now they're just constantly in sight of men who want to kill them just across the waves of the river. And so this type of standoff ensues. There are fords that would allow either side to cross, but both armies are terrified of doing this, as river crossings are one of the most dangerous situations to be in for a battle. Because if you do this, not only do you have to worry about the enemy, but also the waves, and you're forced into this choke point, or kill zone, as they're sometimes called. So the two armies continue to mirror each other as they march east, with both sides too cautious to cross. Finally, they come to a bridge within sight of the city of Balkh, which is in modern-day northern Afghanistan. Now, time is against Husayn and Timur. With every day that passes, that's another day the Mughals have to gather their forces and maybe even march south to face Timur and Husayn. So the brothers decide that they need to act, and act now. And this means crossing that bridge. Now, the good news is that crossing a bridge is definitely better than crossing a ford. But the bad news is that you're still going to be funneled into that kill zone. But they have no choice, they have to act now. So on one of the mornings, soon after both armies have reached the bridge, Timur and Husayn launch their assault across the river. And the Moguls are ready to meet their charge. The Zafarnama, or Book of Victories, one of our best sources on Timur's life, describes what happens next with this. As soon as daylight appeared, the soldiers of both armies, on the sound of kettle drums, gave a great shout, excited for a desire for fighting. Timur passed the bridge and fell upon the enemy, though their army was much more numerous than his and wholly composed of valiant soldiers. But this boldness struck fear into all the enemies, who could not withstand the bravery of our prince, but they fled with great confusion. So the battle was won, and the enemies fled. But remember, this was really just a scouting force. Their job was not to crush Timur and Husayn, but simply to keep an eye on them until the actual army showed up. That said, this battle was probably more of a skirmish, with Timur and Husayn's assault showing their adversaries that maybe it's better to just regroup with the actual Mughal army rather than take them on all here and now. But whether it was a skirmish or a real battle, Timur and Husayn had won. And at this point, the two men decide to split up again, and were not given the reasons why. Although I suspect that since Husayn was now near where his prior kingdom had been, he was probably going to go out and recruit anyone else who would be willing to join them. They need men, they need anybody. And as for Timur, he crossed the Amu Darya with about half of their army, and he headed north. Now, let's take a minute to talk about a bit of geography. This region is very mountainous, and it's difficult to travel through apart from a few roads that cut through the mountains. And the main road from Balkh all the way north to Samarkand is a distance of about 500 kilometers or so. Well, this road narrows at one point between the mountains in a narrow gap called the Iron Gate. Now, the Iron Gate is a bit famous in history, as its importance dates all the way back to ancient times. It even signified the borders of two provinces within the Persian Empire. Today, interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of debate as to just where the Iron Gate is located, as there are a few passes that meet the descriptions. But during the time of Timur, this was a critical point to control. Do you hear that? The rain is really coming down now because they heard I was recording. I don't know who I mean by they there. But this is unfortunate because next week we're going to be talking about a battle that takes place during a huge rainstorm. So it would have been perfect next week, but of course it had to be this week. So I'm sorry if you can hear the thunder and the rain in the background. We're going to just try and ignore it and move forward. If I pretend it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. Anyway, so while Husayn is off doing his thing, Timur moves north to fortify the Iron Gate. And again, the Iron Gate isn't actually an Iron Gate, it's a mountain pass. But, of course, we're going to refer to it as the Iron Gate because that's what it's called, and let's make things more confusing. But Timur is moving for the Iron Gate because should the entire Mughal force arrive earlier than expected, the narrow pass of the Iron Gate is probably their best bet in holding them off. But since it's a several-day journey to get to the Iron Gate, Timur sends mounted scouts ahead of his main force that is slowly following behind. And Timur's scouts arrive there at the Iron Gate, find it free of any Mughals, and then proceed to rest. Or as the Zafarnama claims, the scouts actually fell asleep. Now, they had just been on an intense march through a battle and now a quick ride to the Iron Gate, so maybe that was justified, but they did fall asleep. And then guess what? Yeah, the Mughals show up. The Mughal force, well, this force isn't the main army still, but it does still greatly outnumber Timur's forces. So our sources tell us that back at Timur's camp, he and his men are awakened in the morning by the shouts and screams of their returning scouts, just as the Mughals also descend upon the camp. And the Zafarnama describes it with the following. Our men had not time to rally nor fix themselves in order of battle to oppose the enemy. All they could do after abandoning their tents was to embark for repassing the river. This is a nice way of saying that this total rout ensues as Timur and his men just sprint southwards as the Mughals are shooting and cutting them down from behind. And as they reach the bridge again, Timur has a hard choice to make. If they continue to flee across, the Mughals will simply follow and wipe them out. No, they have to make a stand at the bridge where just a few men can hold off hundreds. So as they're routing across the bridge, Timur calls for his bodyguards and his most trusted companions to stand with him on the bridge in order to hold off the Moguls while the rest of his army can gather back together, hopefully on the other side of the bridge. And we're told that the hero maintained his ground with a handful of brave men with more than human valor. And with this stand, Timur's men were able to make it across the bridge and fortify themselves with Timur soon following. Now, with these pro-Timur sources, it's sometimes hard to decide what's truth and what's heroic myth, but honestly, I can see Timur actually doing this. We know he'll become a brilliant strategist who understands how men function in the heat of battle, and we know that he's a bit reckless at times also. Thus, I would not be surprised if this actually played out just as how we're told. But what follows is yet another standoff with both armies on opposite sides of the river, both refusing to cross against a defending foe. And this goes on for possibly several weeks, until finally Husayn returns with his contingent of their force, along with any new recruits that he managed to pick up. So Timur and Husayn then destroyed their side of the bridge and continue eastwards to Badakhshan. And since the Moguls see that the enemy has more men and that the bridge was destroyed, they just decide to not follow. Better to regroup with the larger Mogul force and then fight them on another day. So the men go to Badakhshan and find that the kings here are very open to an alliance against the Moguls for reasons we talked about earlier. So with these new allies, Timur and Husayn believe that it's now or never to take on the Moguls and to liberate Transoxiana. Now, it's at this point in the story where several of our sources point out an interesting instance that takes place. Along their journey, we're told of this situation in which Husayn gets into a heated argument with one of their new allied tribal leaders. And Timur is the one who has to mediate between them and work out some sort of agreement. And this gives us a quick window into what's to come down the road. While Husayn had a much more impressive resume of leadership and a history of opposition to the Moguls, he lacked something that we're told Timur had. And that was that all of our sources, even anti-Timur sources, mention that Timur treated his men and followers a whole lot better than Husayn did. And as we'll see later, Husayn saw his subjects as almost objects that were below him, objects to be used for his own betterment. Now, we'll see Timur act in a similar way to some of his subjects in the eventual future, but during this part in his life with his own people, he was actually quite supportive of them. So even though Husayn might have, he did have a better claim to power on paper, Timur acted the part of a leader who people would want to follow, and this distinction will become more important later on. But okay, back to the plan at hand. The plan is to go through the Iron Gate north to the city of Kesh, Timur's home city which he once governed, and then from there to Samarkand, crushing any Mughal forces that come along the way, and finally, at some point, we don't know when, but at some point, defeating Ilyas Hoja's army wherever he's encountered. And it's not too long before they do encounter the enemy once again. And this Mughal army is much larger than the other two Mughal armies that Timur and Husayn faced before. And like we've seen twice now, the two armies find themselves on opposite sides of a river, this time the Vaksh River. And in between them lies a stone bridge, wide enough for maybe 10 men to cross at a time. But the situation only gets worse for Timur and Husayn. Seeing this overwhelming foe, thousands of Timur's men flee in the night, leaving him and Husayn with possibly only 2,000 to 3,000 guys. The Moguls, we're told, had maybe 20,000 or maybe 50,000 men, although these are surely exaggerations again, but the point being that Timur and Husayn are hopelessly outmatched. But the battle begins. And this is actually, I believe, the first of many battles Timur will be in where the battle is actually named. This battle is creatively called the Battle of the Stone Bridge, because of the stone bridge. So the first day of fighting is more a long day of skirmishing as the Moguls cautiously edge their way onto the bridge to fling and shoot weapons at Timur and Husayn's men on the other side. But again, neither side is willing to launch a full-scale assault across this choke point. But knowing that time and, everything was against them, Timur and Husayn came up with a plan. Having only 2,000 men, Timur would leave 500 of his strongest, most loyal soldiers at the bridge to hold the Moguls there. Then, in the night, Timur and the other 1,500 men would march down the river cross at a different location, march back to the battlefield, this time on the side of the Moguls, and then surround the Moghul camp. But this was really risky for many reasons, but chief of all is that this maneuver would take an entire day, meaning that those 500 men at the bridge would be alone for that day to face the entire Moghul army. And if these 500 men are killed or if they break, then all is lost. But what choice do we have here? So Timur and Husayn leave with 1,500 men during the night, and the next morning the Moguls see that only a fraction of the force remains. But some Moghul scouts also see that hundreds of horse hoofprints are leading away, and this worries the Moguls as they don't know what's going on. And because of this concern, the Moguls do try to send some men, some token resistance to try and cross the bridge, but this was not a full-blown attack as everybody was kind of confused and very cautious. If this had been a retreat, then why had those 500 men stayed behind? What was going on? And luckily for Timur and Husayn, because these attacks were half-hearted, the 500 men holding the bridge managed to do so. And after a second day of skirmishing, night fell and both sides retired. But while this was all happening, Timur had successfully crossed the river, traveled back to the battlefield, and had secretly surrounded the Moghul camp. And now, as light fell, Timur ordered that his men all light the bonfires that they had been gathering wood for on the way. And as these hundreds of fires ignite in a crescent shape around the sleeping Moghul camp, all of Timur's soldiers let out shouts and war cries. This immediately set the Moguls into a panic, and, well, I'll just let the Book of Victories describe what happens next. This cast fear into the soldiers, who imagined they were surrounded by a numerous army. They therefore fled that night in disorder without fighting. They dared not fly towards the bridge because of the 500 men posted there. And as soon as Timur perceived the effect of his strategy, he came down the mountain like a torrent and fell upon the enemy sword in hand. They slew so many of them that there was nothing seen throughout the field but dead bodies, and Amir Husayn, who arrived with the rest of the army, continued to make a terrible slaughter of them. Thus, so ended the Battle of the Stone Bridge, with Timur and Husayn crushing this Moghul army and scattering those who survived. Now, if you're familiar with old biblical stories, this probably sounds a lot like when Gideon carried out a similar attack on the enemies of Israel, and there is a chance that this story of the Battle of the Stone Bridge didn't actually play out how we're told, but that the story is more meant to portray Timur as a religious hero of old, and this could be the case. But at the same time, we're going to see Timur win other battles with similar tricks, or unconventional warfare methods, you could say. So again, I can buy that this happened. Certainly not in the gigantic scope we're told. There was nothing close to 52,000 men involved here, but if you reduce these numbers quite a bit, it becomes more reasonable. Plus, several of our sources maintain that this is how the Battle of the Stone Bridge played out. And with this victory, the road was now open for Timur and Husayn to push northwards into Transoxiana. And so their next goal was the city of Kesh, Timur's home city and the city which he had once governed just a few years prior. But Kesh was a walled city and reasonably defended. Even if Timur and Husayn managed to take it, the price would be way too large, and then they would inevitably lose against the army of Ilyas Hoxha. It was time for another instance of unconventional warfare. Actually, this probably falls more under psychological warfare. So, as they approach the city of Kesh, Timur orders his men to split up into different squadrons, and then for every man to tie large tree branches and reeds onto their horses. Once this is done, the squadrons will then ride onto the field outside the city, kicking up as much dust and noise as possible, and hopefully this will scare the defenders enough to either flee or surrender. And so, this is what they do. And one of our sources, written by a man named Tariq-e-Rashidi, says this is what happens next. They carried out his orders exactly, so that when they entered the plains of Kesh, the governor, frightened at the sight of so much dust, took to flight. And they entered the town where they occupied themselves with the appointment of officers and the like. So with the appointed Moghul leadership fleeing, Timur and Husayn were free to enter the city without battle, giving them a strategic base from which they could launch the rest of their conquest of Transoxiana. And this also meant that the soldiers of Kesh, now free from Moghul rule, probably eager to fight for their independence, joined Timur and Husayn. Thus, although Timur and Husayn certainly aren't even close to completing the liberation of Transoxiana, they had somehow managed to get a pretty good start. As the Zafarnama concludes this chapter with, "Thus, fortune, which was always favorable to Timur, caused him to triumph over an army by fire and to conquer a city by dust." This has been the Timur Podcast. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your continued support and encouragement. If you want to reach out to me for any time and for any reason, feel free to email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Twitter at podcasttimur or on Facebook at timurpod. Oh, and I'm also on Reddit with the username Timur Podcast. Sometimes I post stupid history memes, so follow there if you feel like it. If you are enjoying the show, I would greatly appreciate if you left a rating or a review. They really do help out, and they're encouraging to see too. And for the host of people who have done this, thank you for doing that. I do see your reviews. Anyway, next week we will continue with Timur and Husayn's conquest of liberation of Transoxiana. And they have quite a few hurdles still to overcome. They have yet to take on the Moghuls of Ilyas Hoja, and then of course Khan Tughlaq Timur will certainly not be too thrilled that the western half of his empire is meddling with independence again. Find out what happens next right here, next week on the Timur Podcast.